The implementation of the law that requires at least 40% of each gender on boards of directors has caught the attention of researchers and journalists as well as business managers all over the world. "You're fired" was the warlike headline in The Guardian on March 6, 2006, alluding to all the men who would now have to find other things to do. I will in this paper give a brief account of the context and line of development for the still relatively new quota law, and also explore the shifting understandings of gender that were put into play when the law was authored, negotiated, and then implemented in 2005, and when sanctions was enforced in 2008. The public in general, including feminists of all sorts, were taken by surprise when the legal intervention was pushed ahead by a Christian center right-wing government. What was equally surprising was the fact that it was the Minister of Trade and Industry who figured as the initiator and spokesperson for the reform, and not the Minister for Equality Matters. I'll try to explain this. Norway is a country where even the most right-wing parties have to demonstrate their will to defend the welfare state. Today, Norway is a very rich capitalist country, where the single main decisive factor on the stock market is the ups and downs of the value of a barrel of crude oil. The Norwegian wealth is a relatively new phenomenon, poor as the country was during the early development of capitalism and imperialism in the 19th and the 20th century. Fortunately, oil became important in the Norwegian economy at a time where we had what one could call state capitalism and decades of social democratic governments after the Second World War. Thanks to a strong social democratic tradition, the state still operates as the main developing agent, investing the money in international funds for the future benefit for the whole population. From the 1970s, Norwegian second-wave feminism was associated with the political left, as it was in other Western countries. The women's movement addressed a broad range of issues, and among them were raised awareness and reforms in the public sector. For many years, women as executives in corporate sector were certainly not on the political agenda. Reaching the 1990s, this changed. Gender quotas had already been applied in the public sector since the 1980s, and women now held a relatively equal share of directing position in the public economical and political enterprises. The political parties had been particularly ready to think equality in terms of results in Norway, rather than equality in terms of equal opportunity. Results rather than opportunity. However, the private corporate sector was still lagging behind. This difference between the public and the private sector was brought to political attention at the end of the 1990s, when increasingly management in the corporate world became understood as the very last bastion in society for women to conquer. The mainstream within the business sphere were, on the other hand, very patiently and in vain, waiting for the natural evolution of gender balance. After all, women were studying economy and management at ever-rising rates. In the beginning, before it really got serious as a parliamentary issue, the ideas of quota law was circulating within various social democratic governments and among its various surrounding supportive political agencies, such as Gender Equality Ombudsman, feminist politicians from a range of parties, and feminists in the bureaucracy on a national level. In 1999, it was time to revise the Gender Equality Act, and a document was sent out on an open hearing. Amongst other things, it proposed the introduction of gender quotas to corporate boards, along parallel lines to that in the public sector. At this stage, the argument for a quota law was based on gender equality. Women ought to have equal representation wherever power and influence were executed, corporate boards included. The reform was passed in Parliament, but the particular part about corporate board quotas was sent back to the government for further consideration. At this stage, the idea of a quota reform did not cause many worries within corporate sector. although it was, of course, critically commented upon. The initiative was simply perceived as too far out to be taken seriously. In the very same period of time, however, managers were increasingly paying attention to boards of directors and the role they potentially could play in good corporate governance and in a company's value creation. In the debates concerning these matters, competence and diversity soon became buzzwords. In 2002, Norway had a three-party Christian center-right government with a conservative Minister of Trade and Industry, Ansgar Gabrielsen. In the spring of 2002, he sent the first shockwaves through the Norwegian media by declaring that he was shit tired of the boys' club. That was the formulation. Because they did not take women on board. His patience with the boys was obviously coming to an end. And he warned them that if they did not pull themselves together, he would take actions most unlikely to come from his office. He would not refrain from proposing a quota law. People will be surprised to see the radical means I'm willing to apply, he said. Gabrielsen's initial rhetoric revolved around gender equality, but that was not to last very long. Gabrielsen had caused a furore by his statements. Corporate executives filled the newspapers with tales of worry in the days that followed his media performance, and the questions and concerns were many. Is the number of women with adequate competence high enough? Do women want this policy themselves? Is enforced recruitment by a quota law the best way to make change happen? Chief Executive Officer June Amundsen, 47 years old, was one typical representative of these reactions. Who could find these women? Where would they be? Will we find them on a website as another escort service? Gender quotation for boards of directors is completely meaningless, he says, and it's hard to imagine that we would find competent women in a database. Ola Mæhle, investor and businessman, was not in favor of quota legislation either. One has to merit a board member position through experience and qualifications, he says. The battle for gender equality is done a disservice by such a law. If I was a woman, I would feel embarrassed if I was a board member by quota. It is worth noticing that in principle, everyone welcomes women in the boardroom. And there was supposedly no open resistance against women as executives. All the CEOs and the investors think it's time for a change. It's only the coerciveness they are against. And as Gender Equality Director Ingunn Yssen summed it up at the time, corporate sector is not against an increased number of women, but they don't like to be deprived of the right to choose men. I think that's quite accurately put. To a large extent, the public debate that followed formed and shaped the subsequent political argument that the government applied to carry the law through the parliament. The political rhetoric was rebuilt to counter the resistance and the concerns from the corporate opponents of the quota law. This new form of argument did not completely refrain from using gender equality arguments. However, Gabrielsen, the government, and most important, the laboratory of equality policy, the Ministry of Equality, has now all realized that a more strictly economic reasoning was crucial to convince the opponents and the skeptics. The reformers' rhetorical strategy was revised, highly influenced by the previously mentioned discourse on good corporate governance and the value-creating board within corporate sector. The arguments turned to the profitability of having women in the boards of directors, and the argument came in short to go like this. The full use of the complete pool of talents will imply economical and competitive advantages both for the society and for individual enterprises. It turned out that by inscribing profitability, the main goal of most private businesses, into the argumentation for the quota reform, it became seriously difficult for the former critics to oppose it. As an advisor from the Ministry of Equality expressed it, I quote, "This debate started within circles concerned with gender equality and justice, but thereafter the argumentation continued within circles where the attention was aimed at reaching out to the business sector, and the idea was to use their reasoning and logics to do so. The justice and equality reasoning was forced to the background, and I would say we've seen a clear shift towards profitability as the main argument." The advisor is probably right to the extent that it had become almost impossible to be against the law proposal. For some of the political agents, equality still made up the important body of arguments for the quota reform. However, from the policymakers' point of view, these actors were of less interest, since they were convinced already. All the efforts were put on economic advantage and social side, and it was one social master level. One master thesis in economics was the only research backing the point, which is interesting too. All other research was put aside. Not only were equality arguments becoming less important because the reformers had the support from feminists from the outset of their work, the equality discourse has such a stronghold in the Norwegian public exchange that to oppose equality as a goal in itself would be interpreted as a sign of anti-women attitude. In gender equality Norway, that would be too risky a path to take for any politician, CEO, manager or investor who were involved in the debate. Since from the policymakers' point of view, it was best to keep gender equality unquestioned and a basically good value, and avoid opening the debate about alternative understandings of gender equality and alternative measures to achieve it. An executive officer in the Ministry of Trade and Industry sums it up. Well, whether you argue with reference to justice or profitability, it's just hard to reject. I mean, this is the right thing, you know. Equality or profitability, who cares, when enforcing a quota law is just the right thing to do. The reason why it was right got a new label in the course of the lawmaking process as good for business, was added to the old equal opportunities label and found common ground in the notion of diversity. When the law proposition was debated in the Parliament in November 2003, the Minister of Equality ended her talk like this. I won't call this a gender quota. We are talking about diversity in the boardroom. In the debate in the Parliament the same day, the previously mentioned Minister of Trade and Industry, Ansgar Gabrielsen, had turned to the same vocabulary. My engagement in this particular case has as its starting points what I primarily will call the importance of diversity in corporate boards in general and the gender perspective included. Diversity had replaced equality as the pivotal concept in the discussion of the reform. This conceptual shift is connected to the economical argument, since it at the time sounded much better in the ears of participants from corporate sector. What is the implication of this in terms of women's contribution to management and execution of corporate power? If women are to symbolize diversity, must they not also be expected to operate different from men? How would we otherwise achieve diversity in this case? Feminist scholars have, of course, themselves pointed to this dilemma, thereby questioning the general framework of the debate. The social scientists Mari Teigen and Hege Skeie published a comment in a Norwegian business newspaper saying, In our opinion, the slogan "gender equality pays off" is hardly palatable. The idea that the end justifies the means does not work. One should not argue for gender equality by notions of money-making. Women are not here to be used, and gender equality is not about profit maximization. Teigen and Skeie are proponents of an equality discourse based on women's similarity with men, rather than on significant differences between the sexes. And they do make a solid point, of course, when they later in the comment ask if male dominance is acceptable if it should be proved that female participation does not increase profits. However good these arguments are to feminist scholars, they were not much paid attention to in this case. The policymakers could not afford to make room for this kind of critical reflection when their aim was to convince on what seemed to be a greater challenge, the corporate sector pervaded by market economic reasoning. Other questions came to the fore after the law had been passed in Parliament. Given all the difference from men, will women be seen as second-rate board members? Will the fact that women's membership is regulated by quota law make them being seen as in an inferior position in the boards of directors? If we turn to the public debate, the answer seems to be no to both. Sanctions would be enforced from 2008 on, and that year was the time for former opponents to convert. We'll let the previously mentioned Amundsen continue to serve as a representative of current views. As we saw, he had strong arguments against the quota law, but first of all, he did not know where to find the women, except by looking for them on the web among the escorts. In November 2007, he had reached a 50-50 balance of women and men in the board of his company. According to him, they are super clever, and it's been a very positive move. All the members of the board are focused on what is best for the company. He was on the front page of the newspaper saying that the meetings contain less dirty talk, which he admits is good, and for the rest, it's business as usual. The discussion was blown out of all proportions, he continues. A company that wants to be up to date must have female members on the board of directors. He is still a bit reluctant to agree to the coerciveness of the law, though, but is otherwise very pleased. What is especially interesting is his notion of a company that wants to be up to date must have female members on the board of directors. It is nowadays perceived, it seems, a bit trapped in a backwater to have only males represented in top-level management. The Pharaoh quota regime and the worries about an appointed woman potentially being seen as second-rate board member seems to fade out too. One can still hear the worried voices saying that women might be seen just as token women rather than as skilled and competent board members. But more prominent are the voices of women within the business elite who started out as critics of the quota law, but are now saying that this might have been the only possible way to make a real change for women's opportunity in the businesses. Anne-Katrine Slundgaard, former mayor of Trondheim and a member of several corporate boards before the reform already, is a representative of this group of women. She speaks of herself as a convert. She used to be against the gender quotas, but through experience she has learned that it could be a necessary mean. Her further reasoning is representative for a new mainstream opinion within the corporate sector. Quote, "To hold the board position is not a right that anyone can claim, neither men nor women. On the other hand, this is about social responsibility and value creation. We cannot afford to let half of the talent pool stay unexploited," she says, without questioning the quality of the competence of these women represents. The Norwegian co-ops, I'll end my talk with saying a little bit about co-ops, quickly followed up and implemented the 40% requirement even before the law actually applied to them. Who wants to lag behind and look old-fashioned and ridiculous? Seems to be the way they were thinking. The practices of Norwegian co-op and Norwegian agriculture co-op illustrate one of the effects of the law. It strengthens the general gender awareness outside of the catchment area of the law. In Norwegian co-op, 38% women on boards of directors, female chair, she's a CAO, and chair of 2 other corporate boards, member of a 3rd board. But management, 6 male CEOs and 1 female CEO, and she is in human relation. And the situation is a little bit the same within agriculture. They implemented the gender quotas before the law applied to them. Male CEOs, 40% women on their boards. So 40% women on the boards, but the chief executive officers in the headquarters are still male. All male in the agricultural co-ops. There is, this is obviously the next challenge for Norwegian corporate feminism. The female chair and CEO in Norwegian co-op also illustrates another point. Women in general hold more than one board position. And we also know that women are networking. This we know from recent research. To sum this up, decades of corporate mentor programs, gender research, seminars, registrations, networking, state feminism, etc., did not help. The effect of the law in terms of numbers was immediate. From less than 10%, it was 5% actually, to 40% women on the boards of PLC companies in 2008, from 2002 to 2008. And the effects in terms of women's actual influence are positive in general. The implementation of the quotas took the share... I've said that. Perhaps you're wondering whether all these women actually have influence on the boards in which they now are members. The picture is varied. They are younger and better educated than their male colleagues, but also less likely to be CEOs, as mentioned earlier, and therefore less likely to have experience from running companies on a daily basis. The women are recruited from the upper sectors of the class hierarchy, and as are their male counterparts. They have attended to the same schools, presumably holding the same values. Not least important, they have the same goals about market profitability for the companies they are elected to manage. However, we do have research concluding that the meetings are experienced as nicer, the paperwork tidier, and that the male board members are better prepared with women present. The law is still relatively new. We do not know the strength of influence of the women's networks as compared to men's, and we are still trying to find out whether informal vertical gender segregation within the boards is developing or not. There is so far no evidence that the women on boards make a difference in terms of the actual decisions that are made in the boardroom. And I doubt we'll ever have conclusive evidence in that direction. But of course, I might be wrong. In certain geographical, economical, and political contexts, it might turn out that women really make a difference, especially in places where they have been largely excluded from the economy outside of their homes. But then, of course, they would probably not be elected or appointed in the first place. There are other interesting examples where women are turned to and expected to make a difference. For instance, Iceland, where in 2009 there was hope that they could help save the economy. We have yet to see how that will turn out. Maybe there are some people from Iceland here. There is no one correct policy for equality, and in this case, no single way of improving gender balance in corporate sector. It seems like Norway was already warmed up and ready for quotas. And if your country is not, I'd say this: get it ready. If not for the quotas itself, so for the stirrups, the raised consciousness, and improvements along the road. Thank you.